Hi, we enter a new chapter today in 2 Samuel 14. But as I was noting in the introductory video to this unit of 2 Samuel 13 and 14, these two chapters are very tightly connected, and I'll show you how in just a moment. So before we enter into the first verses of our chapter, just a few things that connect our whole unit here. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been going through these questions to consider interpreting these two chapters. And now we're on these questions 10 and 11 today. Why does Joab go to Tekoa to fetch the wise woman? It's presented, as we'll see here on the left side of the screen, as if it's just a simple fact with nothing to explain. But there's a lot that needs to be explained that isn't. So we'll explore a little of that there. And what is it about being a wise woman? Is it a role or a description? In other words, is being a wise woman an office or something that someone is appointed to? Or is it simply a description of this woman? So we'll look at that as well. We've also been noting, and it's especially the case here, the parallels between the stories in 2 Samuel 11 and 12 about Bathsheba, and then the little parable about the rich man, the poor man, the ewe lamb, and the traveler that Nathan tells David in order to catch him in the murder of Uriah. Parallel to today about Tamar, not least of which is they each have a prelude about war, and they each start with a sexual violation, and then our immediate situation, as we can see down here, has to do with, as we'll see when we compare 13 and 14, words put into the mouth of somebody else. So here, though, as we start 14, we can see the parallel with Nathan's response to David there, and the woman of Tekoa's response on behalf of Joab there. And as we'll follow up, the story is a parable of David that Nathan tells, and the story the woman of Tekoa tells is also a parody of David. Parallels here that our stories in chapter 13 and 14 both begin with a man and a woman having a conversation, one with words provided by a wise person, Jonadab in chapter 13 speaking to Amnon about Tamar, and the woman of Tekoa given words by Joab speaking to the king. And then we'll see these further parallels as Amnon used deceptive speech to try to coerce Tamar into feeding him and coming up close. The woman will speak of violence in her family, but it's really not about that. It's really about David and Absalom. And then we'll see these further parallels along the way, and we'll look at those as we go. So looking at the shape of our immediate story, it's not chiastic the way we saw a number of elements in the last chapter, although there is a little chiasm here framed by angel of God, and we'll look at that when we get there. But notice the key words throughout. The king, 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 king. And the woman speaks of my lord the king more times than anybody except Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, to which he's very parallel in certain ways, so a number of major parallels. So we see all the purple, my lord the king, and the king, king, king. This is in his role as king, even though it's also his role as father, as the father of Absalom, of course, as well as the dead Amnon. There are also some other interesting elements here. That Joab put the words in her mouth, as the narrator tells us at the beginning, and then she admits that down here to David. It was he, Joab, who put all these words in the mouth of your slave. Then there's three almost equally spread out prostrations. So she falls on the face of the ground and did obeisance before the king. Joab prostrated himself with his face to the ground and did obeisance to the king as well, which is unusual for Joab. And then finally here again, he went to the king and prostrated himself with his face to the ground, and this is sometime later that we'll get to. So punctuated by prostration before the king, and yet her story, which in many ways is at one level incoherent, another level shifts topics, highlights anything but David is someone who should be bowed down to necessarily, even though the language of the story suggests that throughout. So we'll look at our key words here a little bigger so we can see, and we'll begin here in verse 1 and see some of the key elements that we see that set up our whole story. As Brueggemann notes right away, when something needs to be done, both David and the narrator know to call on Joab. But we'll look in a moment at how unusually he appears. Baden notes below, the story of the wise woman from Tekoa is fictional, which is to say, the story that Joab puts in her mouth. It is a continuation of the cover-up of the David and Absalom conspiracy. Or does he mean that the whole story in chapter 14 is fictional? We can read that either way from Baden. David must be seen as disinclined ever to forgive Absalom in order to persuade the reader that he had no hand in Amnon's death. So Baden is seeing here that the whole strategy is to get David out from under Amnon's death and put the guilt of that on Absalom. But of course, David wasn't responsible for Amnon's death, although was he? As I've been noting throughout chapter 13, one of the character issues of David in this chapter as well as in the last chapter is, why is it that someone who seems so perceptive and sharp in avoiding Saul and otherwise covering up some of the violence that plainly plainly he's responsible for, especially the descendants of Saul, is suddenly seem to have no idea what's going on. He has no idea that his son Amnon was lusting after Amnon's half-sister Tamar. He seems to have no idea that Absalom was waiting to get revenge on Amnon for the several years that went by in chapter 13. And now he continues to seem to be unaware that Absalom is plotting to rebel. Can we read it that way, that David is suddenly oblivious? Or do we suggest that David's character is consistent, that he's maybe the sharpest in all of them? After all, in the end, Absalom will be dead and David will still be king. Is that luck, or is that strategy, or is that experience, or some combination thereof? Because one of the possibilities is that David is setting all this up so that Solomon can be the successor, and Nathan will convince Bathsheba that at the very end of 2 Kings, the beginning of the end of 2 Samuel, the beginning of 1 Kings, when the succession actually happens. And if we read it that way, then David has allowed a woman, Tamar, who's never said to be his daughter, to be raped so that Amnon would get killed, arouse Absalom's jealousy, and Absalom eventually get killed to set up Solomon. That's a complex plot, but the plot is complex. And as we'll see starting in the next chapter 15, a whole series of officials and counselors are brought onto the scene that we've never heard of that give both Absalom and David advice as they negotiate with each other in a very different way than Saul was negotiating with David with his band of misfits trying to just hide in caves and to simply get away from Saul. So there's a lot going on that we need to pay attention to, and mostly we need to ask questions about what the text isn't saying. For example, like right here. So now Joab, son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's mind was on Absalom, or as I translate it more correctly to the Hebrew here, knew that the king's heart was on Absalom, and he knew that. Not that he perceived it, but he knew that there. But where was Joab in the last scene? I was noting in the last couple of videos that suddenly Jonadab, who's supposed to be the companion and friend of Amnon, who advises him to have Tamar make these dumplings so that he can get close to her and have his sexual lust satisfied, suddenly seems to be on Absalom's side. Or is he really on David's side? Or is he simply looking to see where the cards may fall and trying to side with the winner as it unfolds? But where was Joab during that whole scene? And where is Nathan? We still don't see Nathan. Nathan won't be here until 1 Kings 1. So some of the other counselors are not there, and suddenly Joab is there. And he'll also be there, as we'll see, after the woman finishes speaking. Suddenly Joab is just right there, as if he's been waiting in the wings all along. So we can certainly perceive, persistent with Joab's character, that he's watching from the sidelines and gathering up information and plotting things out, but not injecting himself until it's necessary. And here he sees it's necessary, and as we'll see, if this isn't jumping too far ahead on intentions that are not stated explicitly, that he sees that with the king's heart is on Absalom to destroy him, to not allow Absalom back, which he ultimately won't allow him. He'll allow him back to Jerusalem, but they won't allow him to meet with him, because Joab understands that Absalom may be plotting rebellion and wants to prevent that from happening here, or something else. We'll wait and see. So let's begin to get into that as we go. So as my note below has, Joab knows the urge to get revenge for a brother's murder, as we saw earlier in the chapter when he got a revenge against Abner for his own brother's murder. He's consistently noted as son of Zeruiah, as we last saw at 8:16, and it highlights the potential violence of Joab, as David had cried out, "You sons of Zeruiah are too violent for me," which most of us as readers are suspicious of because they're doing David's will, but maybe not. Maybe these are simply enforcers who are inclined toward more violence than David is, but we all have to decide that on our own. So he knew that the king's heart was on Absalom, but we don't know what for or against. As Polson notes below, the Hebrew preposition al can be either mean on or against. So his heart can be on Absalom, or his heart could be against Absalom here. And I left it on here because we can't translate it both ways. As Schipper notes, Joab knows what we do not, namely David's feelings toward Absalom. And there are a number of places in this scene where readers are given information that other characters don't have, but characters are given information that we don't have. For example, as we'll see, Joab puts words into the woman's mouth, but we don't know whether the words she says are the words he put in her mouth. It's not one of those scenes like Nathan and Bathsheba, where Nathan tells Bathsheba what to say. We hear her say it, and he comes in and confirms it. It's not one of those examples where Meyer Sternberg helps us draw attention to how speech is named in the one instance and whether it's repeated the same way or it's changed. But here we don't know that. So knowledge is not balanced either within the story among the characters or between the characters in the story in us, especially around intentions, and that leaves us plenty of room for interpretation within the scope of what we've seen so far in the narrative context of both these two chapters and, of course, the wider story of David's reign. So, knowing that Joab knows that the king's heart is on or against Absalom, this is what he does. And what he does is not at all obvious. As Johnson notes below, the story of the woman from Tekoa occupies a middle ground between attributing divine qualities to the king, as we see in 1 Kings 3, when Solomon dreams of having been given the knowledge of good and evil by Yahweh, and rejecting pretensions to divine kingship altogether, as in Ezekiel 28. So he sent to Tekoa, and literally it's send and take, and we have to wonder about a couple of things. Why Tekoa? It's 10 miles south of Jerusalem, and you can see it on this map right here from Google Maps, about 10 miles away, so about perhaps a 6-hour walking journey. But why there? What do we know about Tekoa? Well, later in 2 Samuel, we'll hear, and we can look at that here. This seems obscure, a list of people. Ira, son of Ikash of Tekoa, but we heard a little earlier in that particular scene, that's one of the 30, which is to say David's elite soldiers, and Uriah is one of those. So this is the first reference here to the Bathsheba story. It's one of several, as we'll see in this initial verse for readers that are paying attention. It's also, Tekoa is mentioned in Jeremiah, and it's also the home of the prophet Amos, who was not set out to be a prophet, but a tender of sycamore trees, and was drawn from Tekoa to be a prophet. Are we supposed to associate all those things? Well, we don't know if this text is written before or after Amos, but certainly suggests that Tekoa was a place where there were shepherds, but that's about all we know. So he sent and took, or literally brought, from there a wise woman, Chacham, echoing and contrasting with Jonadab in the previous chapter, so a wise person there and a wise woman here. We see wise woman again in 2016 in 2 Samuel. Let's look at that here. And a wise woman called from the city, listen, tell Joab, come here, I want to speak to you. And she's coming on her own to offer advice on how to come upon this city here and stop Sheba. We won't get into all the details of that now. But she provides wisdom, and whether that's, again, a title, she's the wise woman from the city, that's her role there perhaps, or she's simply a woman with wisdom. Or perhaps she's simply a woman and she's called a wise woman because the advice she gives there is in fact wise, at least from David's perspective. But we don't know that. We can see in Proverbs 14, which is certainly a later text, a post-exilic text, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down. And that's a standard contrast in Proverbs between wise and foolish, whether men or women, but usually gendered like that. But that doesn't really help us because that's a much later text. So we don't really know if she's simply a unique person who happens to be wise, or if she's somebody from Tekoa who holds that office, or if it's someone like a prophet. You find one here and there, and you happen to know there was a wise woman in Tekoa. But then we have to ask, what exactly is her wisdom? Because he's giving her a script and telling her what to say, but we will not know when the script ends and when she has wisdom to continue to speak spontaneously based on David's response. And that certainly would be wisdom, how to be extemporaneous when speaking to the king in a very difficult situation of deception. And let's look at the deception he puts on her here. And notice we don't see whether she can sense or not. We don't hear anything about whether she says, why are you doing this? And what if the king says this? It has nothing to do with like Yahweh calling Moses in Exodus 3, where Moses has a lot of perfectly good questions about what if Pharaoh rejects me and what if the people don't listen to me? And she could have perfectly good questions, but she doesn't seem to have any. So she seems to go along with this either because she knows who Joab is as the leading general or enforcer of the king, or simply she wants to do it, or maybe he's paying her. We don't know. So let's look more closely at the language here. The verb here in New RSV is pretend, but the hitpatel form of this really is make yourself into a mourner. So make yourself into a mourner, and that's parallel to here, and become a woman who's been mourning. So there's actually a little chiasm in that, although the verbs are different. So act like a mourner and put on mourning garments. And the verb and the adjective have the noun rather than the adjective of different forms, but they're basically the same word evel here. And the last time we heard it that way was for, of all people, Bathsheba, as we can see back here. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his woman. So there, the mourning was over, and we'll see yet one more connection that reminds us of the Bathsheba story, and that's important both because it's a parallel story where the king is told a fake story in order to get him to react, but it's also because the Uriah story may well be what's triggering this whole business, as Nathan said at the conclusion of that little story in chapter 12. So put on mourning garments, the normal word for garments here, beged, mourning clothes. Then do not anoint yourself with oil. And the word for anoint was last used in 1220 for David, who anoints himself after the death of the love child. So we have one reference of Bathsheba's mourning being over, and a reference of David who does anoint himself because the mourning is over. So we have three references in the one verse to the Bathsheba story here to draw our attention back to it. But again, as I said, be like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. And then the narrator, is this the narrator or is this Joab? This is still Joab here, as we see. As Falkeman notes below, we readers are dexterously placed in an intermediate position by the narrator between himself and Joab on one hand and David on the other in regards to the degree of being informed, as I was just noting. As Schipper, whose article has been cited a number of times, is really excellent on this chapter, the petition allows the wise woman of Tekoa to highlight the lack of an adequate solution by piling up different methods of appeal that do not lead to a resolution of the conflict. It provides the context for an extended conversation that challenges David to find a proper solution to complex conflicts with extrajudicial factors and demonstrates that he cannot do so, regardless of the way the wise woman of Tekoa frames the issue for him. And that's a little in advance of what we're going to get to when the interaction happens, and we'll begin looking at that next video. So Joab continuing, he says, go to the king and speak to him as follows. Literally, this is a typo down there, speak this word to him. And Joab literally put the words in her mouth. And as my note below has, unlike earlier exchanges of messages, such as over Uriah, when David gave Uriah the message to give to Joab about what to do about Uriah, readers don't hear the original words and know if she's made any changes. So that's our setup, and we'll see next time as she begins to speak to him, she plays the part very well until the very end when what she has to say in his responses gave him a clue that Joab's hand was behind it. But we'll begin to get into that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.